this is again the problem, the quantification problem, which is that you're the first lesson of statistics, and this is Roger L. Martin, who I recommend highly to anybody as a writer. The first lesson of statistics is that if your sample is unrepresentative, you need to tread carefully. Almost all marketing data is hugely unrepresentative because it tells you about transactions which are a very, very distorted part of the overall picture. Because transactions are recorded as a byproduct of the billings process, and it assumes that the value of every transaction is more or less equivalent. But of course, as I argue, if you're the DoubleTree, and I think the DoubleTree is part of the Hilton Group, I hope I've got this right. Okay, if you're busy persuading people to stay at the DoubleTree, not the Hilton, then your value to the overall organization is fairly trivial because you would have got the money anyway. If you persuade someone who would have stayed, with a friend to stay at a hotel, and that hotel is the DoubleTree, that's a very valuable piece of persuasion because it's actually creating incremental money rather than shifting it elsewhere. But you're probably not making that distinction. You're not making the distinction of the value of advertising that isn't accounted for simply because the data is grotesquely unrepresentative. And so it's very easy to justify your job description and your salary as a salesman. It's very hard to justify your job as a warmer-upper, okay? And so when you optimize around an unrepresentative sample of data, and it's, bear in mind, it's unrepresentative not only because we don't collect what's important, we collect what's to hand. That's the first point. But the second point is all big data is unrepresentative because it comes from the past. Okay, there's nothing in the data that suggested that Red Bull or Nespresso or Starbucks would be successful entities. There wasn't any data that said there's a large growing market for cups of coffee at $4. There wasn't any data that suggested there was a market for a 70-cent cup of coffee you made yourself at home. Okay. There wasn't any data that suggested that people wanted a weird tasting drink in a tiny can that cost a fortune. Okay. No data. Okay. And if you only rely on what you've seen in the past to optimize what you do in the future, you're optimizing on the past. And the future is much more fat-tailed than the past because the past was only one variant of a number of what were once potential futures. And therefore, you're trying to be too logical. And in the short term, by the way, it pays because the short-term future is quite accurately described by the past. The long-term future is not described by the past at all, okay? I mean, in the case of weather, okay, you cannot predict the weather more than maybe 15 days in advance, okay? I'll give you an example of this in complexity, okay? So if you want to model mathematically the effect of one billiard ball hitting another, okay, you can do that to an extraordinary level of accuracy. When you get down to the fourth collision, the extent to which tiny variation in the initial stimulus will lead to totally different outcomes if they're four collisions. It's like the three-body problem, okay? You actually need to account for the gravitational pull of the players standing around the table in order to accurately predict what will happen. You need to get down to that level of data and detail in order to predict accurately where the ball will be after four collisions, okay? If all the balls are bouncing around the table. Now, the interesting thing there is that in the short term, you can predict the weather fairly well. In fact, if you're ever locked in a cellar and the serial killer who's captured you says, if you can tell me what the weather's like outside, you're locked in a cellar, remember, okay? I'll let you go. But if you get it wrong, I'll kill you, okay? The safest answer, if you're forced to answer that question, is to say the same as yesterday. Because there's about a 60% chance you'll be right, okay? If the serial killer says, what will the weather be like in 10 days' time? Okay, same as yesterday is totally useless, really. Okay, I mean, it's little better than guesswork. And so once time progresses, the extent to which things become predictable diminishes. And yet what we're trying to do is we're trying to predict the future from basically extrapolating from the past. Now, the tragedy of that is actually that it works quite well in the short term. But when it doesn't work, it doesn't work in the medium term, it doesn't work in the long term, and it doesn't work if you have a major impetus or event like COVID, which fundamentally shakes up all the balls on the table anyway. The best, your best physics model of a billiard table doesn't work very well when there's an earthquake, okay? And the extent to which data-driven decisions are easy to defend leads to them becoming too popular within business decision-making. And we're back to the Sperber-Mercier point now. In their original paper, right in the synopsis, in the abstract at the top, it says, if this theory is correct, we would expect to see people making decisions on the grounds of their defensibility, not on the grounds of their suitability. And I think that the business world is a living exercise in people doing just that. I mean, one of the things you see is HR, but I'll give you an example, IT, okay? If you're in IT, if you have a security breach, okay, you might lose your job. Okay, if you make life easier for employees, you don't get any of the credit. If you introduce software, you probably don't get any credit at all. Okay. Now, as a result, what you see happening in corporate IT is your password changes about every 3 weeks, right? So what actually happens? People react to the frequency of change of password by simply adding a number to their existing password. Okay, which actually makes the system less safe, arguably, that actually if you made them change their password once every 6 months, okay, and they had to choose something totally different. But here's the problem. The IT person has covered their arse by regular password changes, so they're not really interested in the extent to which this is an optimal solution to the problem. Okay, I mean, what happens, okay, I'll give you an example from my own experience. We were forced to use Outlook, okay, and OneDrive. Okay, now OneDrive for a period, they've got a bit better since, to give them credit, but OneDrive was absolutely terrible if you wanted to send large files outside the company. Okay, so everybody starts using bloody Dropbox and they start using WeTransfer and everything else. Now that's less secure than the old system when we were using Google. Okay, it's less secure than us actually, than introducing a please send this outside the company option to OneDrive. But the IT person is more interested in defending his own job from blame and in defending his own career than he is in the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the Ogilvy organization. So that's a classic case where you do the thing that gives you defensibility of decision, not quality of decision. And that's Sperber and Mercier right at the top paragraph. That's what we'd expect to see. Do we see it? We see it in medicine, okay? People basically go, I can be sued for doing nothing. I can't be sued for sending him to exploratory surgery. So they send people to have some, invasive tests done, even though it may not be the best thing to do. I think in the NHS, actually, I think you should be able to sue away in the British National Health Service. One way in which people can be generous to the National Health Service is they can voluntarily sign a thing saying they won't sue except for deliberate malpractice.